If your manager has suddenly started asking more questions, scheduling more check-ins, or reviewing your work more closely than before, don't assume it's a compliment. For years, you showed up, did solid work, and never gave anyone a reason to worry. Then something shifted. You stopped explaining yourself when nobody asked. You stopped chasing praise after a strong presentation. You stopped needing their approval to feel steady in your own work. Your results didn't drop. Your attitude didn't change, but the atmosphere around you changed anyway. And that shift wasn't random. That was the exact moment they started paying attention. I'm Dre. I've spent years sitting in recruiting conversations, compensation planning meetings, and the kind of manager calibration sessions most employees never get invited into. And there's one pattern that keeps showing up in those rooms, across industries and company sizes, that almost nobody talks about outside of them. The person who quietly stops needing approval becomes the person everyone suddenly has opinions about. Not because they did anything wrong, because they became harder to file into a category. If you want to understand what's actually happening on the other side of that shift, stick with this one. And go ahead and subscribe now, because this channel exists to explain exactly this kind of workplace mechanic, the parts nobody puts in the employee handbook. Here's the first thing most people get wrong. They assume managers want obedience. Functionally, that's not quite it. What managers actually want, whether they'd phrase it this way or not, is predictability. They want to know how you'll behave under pressure. They want to know what you're chasing and what you're afraid of losing. Because once those two things are known, you become easier to work with, easier to direct, easier to keep in line without anyone ever raising their voice. Someone who's openly desperate for a promotion is predictable. Someone who needs regular validation is predictable. Someone who's quietly afraid of being let go is predictable. None of that makes a manager a villain. Most of the time, it isn't even conscious. Every organization runs on being able to anticipate behavior, and dependency is usually the cheapest, fastest way to create that anticipation. The problem, from a manager's chair, isn't that you stopped performing. It's that you stopped being predictable in the way they were used to. And once someone becomes harder to read than the people around them, they start standing out for reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of their work. This is where it helps to understand where workplace leverage actually comes from. If you want recognition badly enough, recognition becomes something that can be dangled or withheld. If you want a title, the title becomes leverage. If you're afraid of losing your job, that fear becomes leverage, whether anyone intends to use it or not. Needs create pressure, and pressure is usually what keeps people compliant without anyone having to say so directly. The moment you start closing those needs off, on purpose or just by building a life that doesn't depend entirely on one job, you remove the pressure points a system typically relies on. That might look like paying down debt, building savings, picking up a skill that's valuable somewhere else, or simply reaching a point where one bad review wouldn't derail your life. None of that is rebellion, it's just options. And a person with options negotiates differently, sits in meetings differently, and reacts to criticism differently than a person who feels like there's no way out. Managers can usually sense that difference even when they can't articulate it. And that's often exactly when the extra scrutiny starts. Here's a piece of this that almost never gets explained, because it happens behind a door most employees never walk through. In a lot of calibration and succession planning meetings, employees get quietly sorted into informal categories that have nothing to do with the job title. One of the questions that comes up, sometimes stated directly and sometimes just implied by the conversation, is how easy someone would be to lose versus how easy they'd be to replace. And separately, how easy they are to manage day to day. Those two things aren't the same, and that's the part people miss. Someone can be extremely easy to manage and still be seen as replaceable. Someone can be difficult to manage in the sense of being hard to read and still be considered close to impossible to lose. What changes when you stop needing approval isn't usually your value, it's your legibility in that second conversation. A manager walking into that room used to be able to describe you in terms of what you wanted. Now they can't, and having nothing clear to say about someone in a room like that makes some managers uncomfortable, even when the underlying assessment of your work hasn't moved at all. This tends to get amplified during reorgs, budget cuts, or anything that puts headcount under a microscope, because in those moments, everyone in the room is being pushed to explain their people quickly in simple terms, and you've just become one of the harder people in the building to explain in simple terms. In practice, this rarely shows up as a direct conversation. It tends to show up in smaller ways first. You might notice more meetings added to your calendar that didn't used to exist. You might get asked for status updates on projects that used to run with minimal oversight. Decisions that used to move forward without much discussion might suddenly need another round of review or a second signature. None of it is usually dramatic enough to point to directly, and that's part of what makes it disorienting. It's rarely framed as punishment, and often it isn't intended as one. It's closer to an organization trying to reestablish a level of visibility it used to have into you by default, back when your needs were easier to read from the outside. You might also notice your manager suddenly asking peers or other leads casual-sounding questions about how you're doing, questions that never used to come up before. Or a skip level who previously had no reason to know your name starting to show up in threads you're on. None of these on their own means much. Together, over a few weeks, they usually mean someone is trying to rebuild a picture of you using secondhand information because the direct picture got harder to read. If this is happening to you right now, it doesn't necessarily mean your job is at risk. In a lot of cases, it means something closer to the opposite. It means you've become someone worth paying closer attention to, precisely because you're no longer easy to predict from a distance. This sometimes surfaces directly, in a performance conversation that sounds constructive on the surface. The feedback isn't about your output. It's not about missed deadlines or the quality of your work. Instead, it centers on words like visibility, engagement, alignment, or presence. Translated, that kind of feedback is often less about performance and more about a request, whether the person delivering it fully realizes it or not, for you to become easier to read again. To be clear, this doesn't describe every piece of feedback you'll ever receive, and it doesn't mean every manager asking about your engagement is trying to manipulate you. People genuinely do get feedback about visibility for legitimate reasons, like being considered for opportunities they don't know you'd want. The pattern worth watching for is when that kind of feedback shows up specifically after a stretch of you needing less from the relationship, not before it, and when it arrives paired with more oversight rather than more opportunity. Sometimes it shows up even more plainly, in a comment like, "We just want to make sure we understand where your head's at," delivered with no specific project or number attached to it. Translated again, that's often less about understanding your work and more about wanting a clearer read on you personally. Workplace dynamics vary a lot by company, industry, and individual manager, so treat this as a pattern worth noticing, not a rule that applies the same way everywhere, and not something to assume with certainty about any one conversation you have. Here's the part worth sitting with. The strongest position in most workplaces isn't authority, it's optionality. The ability to stay by choice rather than necessity, and the ability to leave without your life falling apart. Titles matter, but titles belong to the organization, and the organization can change its mind about them whenever it decides to. Options belong to you. Nobody can quietly take those away in a calibration meeting you're not even in the room for. This is part of why building a financial cushion, staying current on your skills, and keeping an active professional network isn't just generic personal finance advice. It's a direct source of workplace leverage that most be a team player advice conveniently leaves out. The version of you that doesn't need this job to survive shows up differently in a room than the version of you that does, even when the actual work on paper is identical. Something else tends to happen over a longer stretch of time, and it helps to know this in advance so it doesn't throw you off. The early reaction to someone becoming harder to read is often friction, more questions, more caution, occasionally more suspicion, because people can't immediately categorize what they're dealing with. But in a lot of cases, that friction eventually settles, and something closer to respect replaces it. Once it becomes clear, the independence isn't hostility toward the team or the company. Confidence without arrogance is rare in most offices. Calm without disengagement is rare. Independence that isn't paired with resentment is rare. And rare tends to get noticed eventually, even by the people who were uneasy about it at first. It usually isn't a dramatic turn either. It looks more like being looped into a decision a little earlier than before, or a manager softening their tone in a meeting where they used to lead with caution. Small signals that the picture of you has quietly updated from unpredictable to simply independent. Knowing all of this is one thing. What you actually do with it is another. And this is usually where people overcorrect in the wrong direction. Some people, once they notice the extra scrutiny, panic and swing back toward the old behavior, over-explaining again, chasing praise again, volunteering reassurance nobody asked for. That tends to backfire because it signals that the independence was fragile to begin with, which is often more unsettling to a manager than the independence itself. A steadier approach is simpler than it sounds. Keep documenting your own wins in plain, factual language, not as a defense, just as a record that exists independently of anyone else's memory. Keep building the parts of your life that don't depend on this specific job. Savings, skills, a network that isn't limited to people at your current company. Stay professional and easy to work with day to day, because none of this is a license to become difficult on purpose. And resist the urge to explain yourself out of the discomfort. The goal isn't to make yourself easier to predict again. It's to get comfortable being one of the harder people in the building to sum up in a single sentence. Because that discomfort, uncomfortable as it feels in the moment, is usually a sign of where the actual leverage sits. So no, your manager probably isn't nervous because you did something wrong. In most cases, they're recalibrating because you became harder to influence inside a system that runs on being able to influence people. That's not a flaw in you, and it's usually not a conspiracy against you either. It's closer to a structural reflex. Systems built on incentives get uneasy around the one variable they can no longer fully predict. Understanding that changes how you experience the extra meetings, the added scrutiny, the sudden interest in your engagement. You stop taking it personally, and you start seeing it for what it actually is: a system momentarily unsure of its own read on you, not a verdict on your future there. The goal was never to become impossible to manage for the sake of it, and it was never to punish anyone for wanting predictability. Since most people, including most managers, are just trying to do their jobs with the information available to them. The goal is simply to notice. The next time a title or a piece of praise or a fear of consequences starts pulling at you harder than the facts of the situation warrant, that the pull itself is the leverage point, and you get to decide how much of it you hand over. If this is the stage you're at right now, that's usually a sign you're doing something right, not something wrong. If you want the next layer of this, including what tends to happen once that scrutiny period passes, subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop a comment with the moment you first noticed your manager paying closer attention to you. I read those, and some of them end up shaping the next video.